Are you interested in angels, demons, ghosts, spirits, and monsters? Are you curious about their origins, tales, and influence upon history and on the present day? If so, then sit back, relax, and welcome to Southern Demonology, the podcast that explores all of this and more.
Hello all, and welcome back to another episode of Southern Demonology. As always, I am your friendly neighborhood ancient demonologist, JJ. Tonight, we are going to talk about the Nephilim, but not in the lazy way this subject is usually handled. This is not going to be another episode about giant skeletons, half-baked conspiracy theories, or internet nonsense wearing a cardboard crown and pretending to be scholarship. The real horror of the Nephilim is not that they were large. The real horror is that in the world of First Enoch, they were never supposed to exist at all. They are not presented there as mere tyrants from a distant age. They are the result of a boundary violation so profound that the text treats it as an assault on creation itself. The Watchers do not simply desire, descend, and sin. Before they ever take wives, they bind themselves in a curse. They do not stumble into transgression. They covenant themselves into it. They swear together that they will do this thing and that none of them will turn back. That matters because it tells us the Nephilim are born not merely from illicit desire, but from a kind of anti-covenant. The Watchers form a pact against the order of God, and the Nephilim are the fruit of that pact. They are the offspring of rebellion made flesh. And that is where the subject stops being merely strange and starts becoming terrifying. Because in First Enoch, the great problem is not simply that angels sinned sexually. The deeper horror is that spirit and flesh were forced together in a way that should never have happened. The Nephilim are treated there as the ultimate perversion of categories that God had kept distinct. Heaven and earth are not supposed to collapse into one another. Spirit is not supposed to propagate with flesh. And when that line is crossed, the result is not a marvel. It is an abomination. That is the real center of gravity for this episode. The Nephilim are not frightening because they are giants. They are frightening because they are what happens when creation is violated at the deepest level. Now, before we go any further, let me put a caution right where it belongs. I am not going to pretend that First Enoch is the same thing as the Hebrew Bible. It is not. Nor am I going to pretend that every Christian tradition receives it the same way. They do not. But I am also not going to pretend it is irrelevant, because it very clearly was not irrelevant in the world of Second Temple Judaism. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Watchers tradition, and later Jewish demonology all make that obvious enough. So, if we are going to speak carefully, we need to distinguish our layers. In Genesis 6, the Nephilim are brief, ancient, and mysterious. In Numbers 13, they reappear in a more historicized form as gigantic inhabitants of the land. But in First Enoch, they become a full-blown theological horror. And that is where I want to stay tonight. Now, the term Nephilim itself is slippery. In the older biblical material, the meaning is not nearly as tidy as modern people often assume. Ancient translators often render them as giants, and that is why the giant idea became so fixed in the imagination. But the term also invited associations with falling, and later traditions certainly exploited that. The Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible notes that Genesis 6 places the Nephilim in a context where the distinction between divine beings and humans is being violated through gross physical contact, and that these figures are the monstrous offspring of those illicit unions. That alone already tells you the issue is not size by itself. The issue is transgression of order. And that is exactly what First Enoch seizes and amplifies. The Watchers are sent to watch over the generations of humanity. That is their station. That is their calling. But they look upon the daughters of men, desire them, and then do something that deserves much more attention than it usually gets. They bind themselves in a curse. They make a pact. They seal their rebellion in advance so that none of them can retreat when the time comes. The descent begins not with passion alone, but with a sworn act of collective defiance. And it is one of the sharpest details in the whole tradition. That means the corruption starts before the union itself. It starts in the will. It starts in a deliberate solidarizing with evil. The sexual transgression is the visible act, but underneath it is something even darker, a chosen and ritualized rebellion. And once that curse-backed pact is in place, the rest follows with horrifying logic. They descend, they take wives, they produce offspring. And those offspring are not merely violent creatures. They are the embodied result of a sworn revolt against the created order. That is why the Nephilim matter so much in First Enoch. They are not simply children of sin. They are the children of a sealed rebellion. Now, if you want to understand why First Enoch treats them with such horror, it is not enough to say that they were violent. Lots of figures in ancient literature are violent. The deeper problem is what they are. They are born from the joining of two realms that were never meant to be joined in that way. Their fathers are heavenly beings. Their mothers are human. So the Nephilim stand as an unlawful amalgam of spirit and flesh, and the text treats that mixture as fundamentally monstrous. This is where one of the most important passages in the Enochic tradition comes in. The Watchers are rebuked for leaving heaven, taking wives, and producing flesh and blood, even though spiritual beings were not made for that mode of life. The distinction is drawn with painful clarity. The spirits of heaven belong in heaven. The spirits of earth belong on earth. But the Nephilim are the offspring of a violation of that order, and therefore they become something hideously unstable. The horror is not just the act of lust, but the commingling of spirit and flesh in defiance of the natural order. And that is why the flood in the Enochic imagination never feels like a complete solution. If the Nephilim were only flesh, then their destruction would end the problem. But First Enoch refuses to let the problem end there. Their bodies perish, but their spirits do not. The text says that the spirits of the giants remain on the earth as evil spirits to afflict, oppress, attack, destroy, and trouble humanity. The Dictionary of Deities and Demons states this very plainly in its discussion of the Watchers tradition. These things are horrifying not simply when they live, but after they die. That is the theological nightmare at the center of the Nephilim tradition. The bodies can die, the problem does not. And that is what makes the Enochic version of the Nephilim so much more disturbing than the casual giant talk you often see online. The true horror is not their size, it is their composition. They are made of two things that should never have been mingled, and because of that, their destruction does not restore order. It leaves behind a residue. Their spirits persist as evil spirits on the earth. Now, I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to miss just how radical that claim really is. In the Enochic worldview, the Nephilim are not simply the cause of ancient violence. They are the origin point for a continuing demonic infestation. Their existence explains why evil spirits remain active after the flood. That is one reason later, works such as Jubilees can continue building on the same assumption, and why the Watcher's entry in the dictionary notes that in Jubilees the evil spirits remain under mastema to keep corrupting humanity. Once the spirits of the giants remain, the flood stops being a total reset and starts looking more like triage. And honestly, that is one of the reasons this tradition had such staying power. It explains too much. Why are there evil spirits? Why does the world after judgment still feel haunted? Why does corruption persist after catastrophe? Why does the flood not feel like a final solution? The Enochic answer is that the Nephilim left behind spirits that remain hungry, thirsty, violent, and hostile. They no longer have bodies, but they still have appetite. They no longer have flesh, but they still bear the trauma of being made from flesh and spirit together. That is exactly the sort of cosmological horror that lodges itself deep in the imagination. Now, the Nephilim in 1st Enoch are not passive. They are not tragic curiosities. They are monstrous in appetite and action. They devour, destroy, and fornicate with everything they can. They sin not only against humanity, but against animals and the earth itself. Their violence is not merely social. It is cosmic in the sense that it disorders every layer of creaturely life. They are appetite without proportion. They are power without boundary. They are the embodied proof of what happens when the created order is breached. That is one reason they function so well as the direct prelude to the flood. The world is not merely sinful in a general sense. It has become contaminated. The boundaries between heaven and earth have been crossed. Secret knowledge has been weaponized, and the offspring of that rebellion now consume and violate everything around them. The flood, in that framework, is not simply punitive. It is an attempted reset. But then comes the twist, and it is a devastating one. According to the Enochic account, the reset does not really work cleanly. The giants are destroyed, yes. Their bodily power is broken, but their spirits remain. And because those spirits remain, the deluge changes the form of the corruption without utterly removing it. If Raphael sends the flood to wipe away the giants, and yet their spirits remain in the atmosphere, then the deepest problem has not been solved. It has merely changed registers. And that, I think, is where the material stops being merely interesting and starts becoming genuinely unsettling. Because now the question is no longer, were the Nephilim big? The question becomes, what happens when creation is breached? What happens when a spiritual order that belongs in heaven forces itself into the domain of flesh and blood? What kind of thing is produced? And what kind of damage does it leave behind even after judgment falls? That is the question one Enoch wants you to ask. Now I want to bring in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because this is where the whole thing becomes vividly practical. In 4Q510-511, the instructor invokes God's glorious splendor to terrify the spirits of the angels of destruction, the spirits of the bastards, demons, Lilith, howlers, desert dwellers, and those spirits that suddenly strike in order to lead astray and charm hearts. That passage becomes one of the clearest examples that the community behind the scrolls did not treat this material as dead myth. The spirits of the bastards are the continuing threat from the Nephilim tradition. They are still here. They are still dangerous. They still need to be repelled liturgically. That means the Nephilim were not merely those old giants. Their dead were still active. Their spiritual residue still moved through the world. The destruction of their bodies had not removed their threat. That is why the prayer from Qumran seeks protection not just from demons in the abstract, but specifically from the spirits associated with the watchers and their offspring. The prayer assumes that what First Enoch says about lingering hostile spirits is not a literary flourish, but a live spiritual reality. And this is where I want to add the part that makes the whole thing even eerier. In the broader Enochic and Essene imagination, the danger is not only spatial, it is temporal. One of the most fascinating ideas preserved in this stream of thought is that time itself can function as a temple. In the solar calendar associated with Enochic and Essene thought, the year is structured as 364 days. That arrangement allows time itself to be conceived as ordered, symmetrical, and enclosing. 4 quarters of 91 days create something like a sacred enclosure, a temporal sanctuary, a holy structure built not of stone, but of rightly ordered time. The 364-day year forms a temporal temple surrounding those established with God. That is a remarkable idea in its own right, because it means holiness is not only spatial, like a sanctuary or holy of holies, it can also be calendrical. It can surround a people through ordered time itself. But there is a catch. If you think of that perfect order as a kind of enclosure, there remain 4 leftover days, 1 at each turning point. Those 4 days become deeply ominous. They are the days of trouble. They fall outside the clean symmetry of the temporal temple. They are the exposed corners, the points where sacred order does not close cleanly, the times when even the faithful may be especially vulnerable. And that is where the whole thing becomes truly chilling. Because if the spirits of the Nephilim remain in the atmosphere, if the watchers are bound yet somehow still dangerous, and if hostile spirits continue to afflict humanity after the flood, then these leftover days become more than a calendrical curiosity. They become moments of exposure. They become times when the protective order weakens and the hostile residue of the first great transgression presses more closely against the human world. On those 4 days of trouble, the spirits of the bastards, the watchers, and the rest of the hostile host can strike even the most faithful. That is one of the most haunting ideas in this whole body of tradition. It does not merely say that evil spirits exist. It imagines a world in which sacred time itself is a defense, and in which breaches in that order create danger. So the story of the Nephilim does not end with their birth. It does not even end with their death. It extends into the structure of sacred time, into the fear that there are seasons or moments in which the hostile residue of that first great transgression presses more closely against the human world. Now, I do want to say something careful here, because this is exactly the kind of subject that attracts nonsense. There is a whole modern ecosystem of Nephilim speculation that is absolute garbage. Every conspiracy theory eventually stumbles into the Nephilim are secretly running the world, or they were never destroyed, or every strange archaeological photograph proves Genesis 6 exactly the way a terrible thumbnail says it does. That is not what I am talking about. I am talking about what First Enoch and related Second Temple material actually do with the tradition. And what they do is already frightening enough without our help. They present the Nephilim as the product of illicit mingling, as violent corruptors of creation, and as the source of evil spirits whose hostility to humanity survives bodily death. That is more than enough theological horror for one episode. Now, there is another angle here that deserves to be stated as plainly as possible. The Nephilim are not simply perverse because they are hybrids. They are perverse because they invert proper order. In First Enoch, spiritual beings are told explicitly that heaven is their dwelling, while fleshly beings belong to the earth. That distinction is not incidental. It is part of the text's cosmology. So when the Watchers produce the Nephilim, they are not merely doing something disobedient. They are collapsing domains that were meant to remain distinct. And once those domains collapse, violence follows. Appetite follows. Disorder follows. Evil spirits follow. That is why the best way to talk about the Nephilim is not as big, scary, ancient guys. It is as the ultimate anti-creation act. They embody category violation. Spirit behaves like flesh. Flesh absorbs what belongs to spirit. The result is neither one thing nor the other, but a destructive counterfeit. That is why the text treats them as abominations, and why, even after their bodies fall, their continued spiritual existence becomes a lingering insult to the created order. And that is also why the idea remains so potent. It is not merely the fear of ancient monsters. It is the fear that once the deepest boundaries of creation are violated, the consequences cannot simply be washed away. That is the theological nerve this tradition keeps touching. If spirit and flesh are commingled in defiance of God's order, then bodily destruction does not fully undo the damage. The body dies. The corruption lingers. That is why these spirits remain hungry, thirsty, violent, and resentful. They have lost the flesh they once had, but their appetite persists. In that sense, the Nephilim become one of the most chilling explanations in ancient Jewish literature for why the world after judgment remains spiritually dangerous. So where does all of this leave us if we want to summarize the Nephilim responsibly? I would put it like this. In the Hebrew Bible, the Nephilim are ancient and enigmatic beings associated with primeval and heroic antiquity. In 1st Enoch, however, they become something much more specific and much more terrifying. The offspring of the Watchers and human women, born from a rebellion the Watchers first sealed by binding themselves in a curse and representing the unlawful fusion of spirit and flesh. Their violence contaminates the earth before the flood, but their true horror lies in what happens after they die. Their spirits remain on the earth as evil spirits that continue to attack and afflict humanity. And in the wider Enochic and Essene imagination, that danger is woven not only into the world after the flood, but even into the structure of sacred time itself, especially in the 4 exposed days outside the perfect enclosure of the temporal temple. And that, to me, is why the Nephilim endure in the religious imagination. Not because they are large, not because they are flashy, but because they represent the terror of a world in which boundaries have been broken, creation has been violated, and the consequences refuse to stay buried. So when we speak of the Nephilim, we should not reduce them to giant men from a half-remembered age. In 1st Enoch, they are something much worse. They are the product of a rebellion the Watchers sealed with a curse. They are the offspring of a union between spirit and flesh that should never have occurred. Their violence contaminates the earth before the flood, and their disembodied spirits continue to afflict humanity afterward. And in the wider Enochic and Essene imagination, that danger is woven not only into the past, but even into the structure of sacred time itself. That is why the Nephilim remain so potent. They are not frightening because they are big. They are frightening because they are wrong. They are what happens when spirit and flesh are forced together in defiance of God's order. And once that happens, the text says, the damage outlives the body. That is a haunting idea. It is a dangerous idea. And it is exactly why the Nephilim still loom so large in the religious imagination. Thank you for listening to Southern Demonology. Stay safe out there.
Thank you for listening to Southern Demonology. Find us online at southerndemonology.com, where you can find all of our social links, including YouTube, TikTok, and Patreon, in addition to listen to episodes and read their transcripts. Also, if you have a moment, please rate this podcast and share it with friends, as nothing can help us grow more.